Alone, yes, that's the key word. The most awful word in the English tongue. Murder doesn't hold a candle to it, and hell is only a poor synonym. Hello and welcome to part 2 of my exploration of great horror from the 1970s. If you haven't seen part 1, I'd encourage you to check that out. In this video, I'll be expanding on some of the themes and topic discussed in that video. Whereas in part 1, we took a look at horror books from the early parts of the decade. In this video, I'll be focusing primarily on books that came out from 1974 through 1976. And in the first part, we talked about parapsychology, the terror of the traditional family unit, and the evilness of sex. In this video, we're going to have to talk about, you know what we're going to have to talk about.
Who could it be? I just can't imagine who. Could it be Satan?
That's right, we're going to have to talk about Satan. Satan was very popular in the 1970s. But 70s Satan isn't your grandmother's Satan. Or maybe it's your grandmother's Satan. I don't know how old you are. But 70s Satan is not your traditional Satan, if you will. 70s Satan was very unique and very 70s. We'll get to that later. And I also have 9 books I want to take a closer look at. But before we do that, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. I do appreciate the support, and it is helpful for me to keep me motivated, keep me putting out videos, so thank you. I'm going to run a quick intro sequence featuring some cool book covers from the 1970s and featuring the music of one of my favorite composers, John Adams. And I'll see you on the other side to talk about some great and important horror books from the mid-1970s. In 1971, a book would come out that would have a huge impact on horror, a huge impact on a swath of cultural and political movements at that time. And that book was not a horror book. In fact, it was marketed as nonfiction or Christian theology. And that book was The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, and it was a huge success. In this book, Hal Lindsey gives us a new interpretation of the Bible, predominantly the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. And this interpretation falls under the umbrella of dispensational eschatology. Big words, right? Eschatology refers to the end of the world or end times theology, and dispensationalism is a 19th century Protestant movement that divides history into ages or dispensations according to how God interacts with his believers or with his chosen people. And it's based on Bible literalism, the belief in the eventual restoration of the nation of Israel, which precedes the rapture of the church. This is when all the Christians get pulled into the sky and disappear from the earth, which ushers in the tribulation or hell on earth and the return of Jesus Christ. And this idea, this dispensationalism, it started in the United States in the mid-19th century, and it spawned a lot of doomsday cults or sects of Christianity in the United States that would say, oh, the world is going to end on this date, right? And despite the world not ending, this belief continued to grow in popularity, culminating in this work by Hal Lindsey from the early to mid 1970s. So the late great planet Earth takes Bible verses and Nostradamuses them, right? It takes these lines of poetry and says, this one refers to a war in the Middle East, and this one says that Satan is going to be born in Missouri or whatever, right? It's a combination of Bible literalism and an inventive interpretation of 4,000-year-old Middle Eastern poetry mixed with conspiracy theories and geopolitics of the time. The late great planet Earth was the Da Vinci Code of the 70s, and it was widely read and widely influential, especially in US Christian fundamentalism movements, but also in pop culture and definitely in horror. It tells the story, or rather predicts, the disintegration of society, the birth and rise of Satan as a physical man incarnate, his rise to power, and the rapture of the Christians from the earth, the subsequent tribulation, hell on earth, and then Jesus coming back and going full on Arnold Schwarzenegger and kicking ass and saving the day, right? So as you can imagine, this is very intriguing to horror creators. And it's worth pointing out that although this is a Protestant movement, for horror, they married it with Catholicism, because Catholicism gives us familiar rituals, it gives us some creepy, sometimes gory imagery, and it gives us a hierarchy in the church that has a history to it and shrouded sometimes in mystery and secrecy. So all of that plays really well with horror. And a great example of this is The Omen by David Seltzer from 1976. This book has a fantastic opening. This guy, he's the US ambassador to England, right? He's at a hospital and his wife is giving birth. Now, she's had some miscarriages in the past and her health is such that this is her last chance to have a child, something she really, really wants. But the baby is delivered stillborn. However, she lost consciousness during the delivery, so she doesn't know this. And coincidentally, while she was giving birth, the hospital received a child from this poor woman who doesn't want the child because she can't take care of it. She doesn't have any family. So the hospital, they suggest, hey, why don't you take this orphan baby and give it to your wife and say that it's hers, right? You'll be saving an orphan baby and sparing your wife the heart-crushing news that the baby was delivered stillborn and she'll never be able to have a child. Now, it's a lie and a deception, but it seems like a solution that could solve many problems and spare a lot of heartache. So the guy, he takes the baby and passes it off as theirs. Turns out that the baby is the Antichrist. You win some, you lose some, right? So the guy, he spends the rest of the book in a very 1970s fashion, thinking about and then trying to kill his evil child. Now, David Seltzer was a screenwriter and he wrote The Omen for a movie, which is an excellent movie, I think. And it was a huge hit, so he then created this novelization. Now, because he is a screenwriter and not a novelist, I think that it shows in the writing. While I love the story, especially the great opening and the gut punch ending, I do think that the writing is pretty weak in places, especially the action scenes. So if you are picky about writing quality, like I am, I think you might find this book a bit frustrating or underwhelming. If you're not picky about writing quality and care only about this story, then I think this book could be a great read for you. In either case, you should check out the movie. It's really good. The Omen takes this dispensationalist idea of Satan being born a man and coming to power to take over the earth. It takes that idea and it marries it with the Catholic Church, with Catholicism, because of the rituals and the imagery and the church hierarchy, often shrouded in mystery and secrecy, right? And in fact, the Catholic Church was very popular in horror in the 1970s. William Peter Blatty gave us The Exorcist in 1971, which was a huge hit, and I'll be saving my take of that book for a future video. But another great example of the Catholic Church in horror in the 1970s is The Sentinel by Jeffrey Combs from 1974. So I'm researching horror books in preparation for making these videos, and I'm looking at lists of great horror books from that decade, and The Sentinel keeps popping up on these lists. And to be honest with you, I had never heard of this book. So to do research for these videos, I read it, and wow, how had I never heard of this book before? I thought it was excellent. It's one of the highlights of my research. So the first half of this book gives us a slow atmospheric horror that reminded me a lot of Rosemary's Baby. A woman in her mid-20s, thereabouts, she moves into an old brownstone in Manhattan filled with quirky and creepy neighbors, and she's in a relationship with a man who seems to be kind of shady, and some stuff happens to her, and maybe it's all in her mind, right? So a lot to remind me of Rosemary's Baby. But then halfway through the book, it takes a hard shift and turns into a page-turning mystery filled with constant clues and revelations and plenty of red herrings. And then it returns to horror for the climactic ending. The book is about 320 pages, and I read it in 2 days, so I was really into it. It does go to some pretty extravagant places to introduce the horror. So a few times I'd be rolling my eyes, but then I'd get over it, I'd go along with it, and I was immediately back in the story, having a lot of fun. It's a fun read, it's well done. It was one of the better reads for me this month. The mid-1970s, specifically 1974, featured strong debuts from two horror writers that would go on to enjoy tremendous success and shape the horror landscape for decades. James Herbert and Stephen King. I'll start with James Herbert and his debut offering, The Rats. In The Rats, a scientist takes an oversized rat from a radioactive island and brings it back to London to breed it with local rats. Now, this is not a spoiler, but that project does not go well. So London is infested with hundreds of thousands of organized, bloodthirsty rats. This book sets up quite a few interesting and fun set pieces where a group of characters have to survive, or not, hundreds of rats attacking them. It's almost a vignette style of storytelling where instead of following one character or a group of characters closely, the story unfolds through a collection of short action scenes presented from different perspectives. It's the same type of storytelling device or method he would use in his follow-up, The Fog. We do have main characters, but we also have many tangential set pieces. One in particular that really stuck with me is where the rats infest a school. And in doing so, they cause a flood. So all the teachers and the kids, they have to barricade themselves in a room on the top floor while the water rises and hundreds of thousands of rats pour in. That was a lot of fun. This book is not going to win any literary prizes, but it promises thousands of bloodthirsty mutant rats, and it delivers on that promise. I had a lot of fun with it. In the same year, 1974, Stephen King gave us Carrie, the story of a teenage girl with telekinetic powers and her eventful appearance at the school prom. A very 1970s premise. Now, I liked Carrie. But if we're talking murderous teenage girls from the 1970s, I'd rather tell you about Elizabeth by Ken Greenhall from 1976. Elizabeth lives in a swanky Manhattan apartment with her grandmother, her aunt, and uncle. And you know that trope where you have an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other? Well, Elizabeth, she doesn't really have an angel, and her devil isn't on her shoulder, it's in a mirror. And when she looks into her special mirror, she sees Frances, a young woman who claims to be a witch and who claims to be one of Elizabeth's ancestors. And she also claims that she can help Elizabeth discover her witchy powers, which would help her get rid of that pesky governess and all the other adults in her life she'd rather do without. Elizabeth is a fun, dark, creepy, witchy tale. It was also Ken Greenhall's debut book. He would go on to give us Hellhound a few years later, which I'll talk about in part 3 of this series. Now, if you like your murderous girls younger than 16-year-old Carrie or 14-year-old Elizabeth, can I interest you in a murderous 5-year-old? Her name is Bonnie, and she's such a sweetheart with golden locks and deep blue eyes. And she is the star of The Godsend by Bernard Taylor from 1976. Bonnie, from birth, gets taken into a family, a rather large family. She has 3 brothers and 1 sister. And as Bonnie grows older, her family gets smaller. Now, this book kills a lot of small children, which is a tough sell, or maybe not. But there isn't any gore, and it's not super violent despite the story it's telling. Basically, when a child has an accident, that's kind of the end of the chapter. And then we pick up on the story several months later or several years later. So we don't get bogged down in legal proceedings or the grief of the family. It's basically the family recovering from the tragic accident that killed one of their children. Rinse and repeat until there's only 1 child left. As far as Killer Kids books goes, The Godsend's not bad. It's well written and well paced. But it's hard not to compare it to 1954's The Bad Seed by William March. And as entertaining as The Godsend is, it doesn't really bring anything unique or special to the genre. It doesn't do anything that The Bad Seed didn't do already, and probably did it better. So if you're only going to read one Killer Kid book, I would recommend The Bad Seed. But if one Killer Kid isn't enough for you, then yeah, The Godsend's pretty good too. In researching horror books from the 1970s in preparation for making these videos, I consulted many lists, and there were a few books that frequently came up on lists from this period of the mid-1970s that I haven't talked about yet. So I'd like to close this video by briefly talking about 4 of those books. Jaws by William Benchley from 1974. This has one of the best openings in all of horror, I think. A couple, they go down to the beach at night, and the guy, he crashes drunk on the sand while the girl goes for a little skinny dip in the ocean. Harmless fun. It's a fantastic opening. The ending is pretty good too, but in the middle, the story goes off on a tangent, and instead of talking about the shark or the people trying to kill the shark, it focuses on a woman who's having an affair. Has nothing to do with the plot, and it has nothing to do with character development either. And it was quite long too. It just served to rip me from the story and have me like the characters a bit less. After having read the book, I have an even greater respect for Steven Spielberg as a filmmaker, because he took this book and he took all the great things about the book, threw out all the unnecessary and unpleasant, boring stuff, of which there's quite a bit. And he made a few interesting changes to some of the characters and even the way that the shark is hunted. And I think all of the changes he made worked to make the story better. So Jaws isn't, it's not a bad book, not at all, but I don't think it's in the same league as the movie. Opening scene accepted. Also making frequent appearances on great horror books from the 1970s is The Auctioneer by Joan Sampson from 1976. Now this was a surprise to me because I don't consider this book to be horror, not in the slightest. It's about an auctioneer who comes to a small town and he gives the residents a lot of money for their junk. And then he starts giving them a little less money for some of their stuff that isn't junk, until eventually he just takes all their stuff and gives them nothing in return. There's no real horror to it. It's more like a morality tale about greed and about standing up to bullies. I was quite frustrated reading this book because the characters, they take a long time and suffer a lot of injustice before they finally get around to standing up for themselves and fighting back. It's not a bad book, but it's not horror, in my opinion. Also, a book that made quite a few lists was The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane by Laird Koenig from 1974. And again, I do not consider this to be a horror book. The story is horrific. In fact, I talk about this book in depth in my video, Most Disturbing Books Ever. It's disturbing and horrific, but stylistically, I wouldn't consider this to be a horror book. Also frequently appearing on lists of great horror books from the mid-1970s is The Doll Who Ate His Mother by Ramsey Campbell from 1976. To be honest with you, prior to making these videos, I had never heard of The Doll Who Ate His Mother, but I was intrigued by the title, and so I read it. Technically, it's not a doll, and technically, he doesn't eat his mother. So the book fails to live up to the promises its title made. It does have some black magic in it, which was really cool. I just wish that it had been explored more. The book sets up a very interesting lore and a potentially badass villain, but his role in the story is so small, unfortunately. There is a little bit of blood, not much, and not much horror either. It's a slow book that only picks up in the last 20 pages or so. It's not bad, but I was left a bit underwhelmed. For me personally, the highlights of the mid-1970s would be, in no particular order, Carrie, Elizabeth, The Sentinel, and The Rats. What are your favorite books from this time period? Do you have any experience with the books I talked about in this video? I'd love to hear your comments, feedback, questions, criticism, whatever you have to express. I'm happy to listen. I'm going to be putting out part 3 soon. I still have 2 books I want to read in preparation for making that video, so give me a few days. Until then, thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.